What's up, everybody? My name is Joe Brown, and this is Heresy Financial. It's no secret, financially speaking, things have gotten a little bit crazy lately. I mean, in Congress, if you present a bill and it's not for at least $1 trillion worth of spending, it's not even considered to be serious. And these are just mind-boggling numbers that nobody can actually comprehend. The US debt to GDP is well over 100%. Asset prices are near all-time highs. The global debt to GDP is well north of 300%. And that's just debt. That's not all leverage in the system. When you consider the opaque derivatives market, the total leverage in the system is many times more than that. Suffice it to say that the world is more leveraged today than it has ever been in world history. And one thing is certain about high leverage. It is always followed by deleveraging. And with China's situation with Evergrande, Treasury yields spiking, the stock market dropping, the US government potentially on the verge of defaulting on the national debt, many people are wondering, is this the beginning of a deflationary deleveraging? Now that's possible, but there are others who are saying this is the beginning of a massive period of very high inflation. So in this video, we are going to talk about why, from a leverage point of view, it doesn't matter, because whether you have inflation or deflation, you still have the massive deleveraging and massive economic pain as a result. Ready? Let's dive in. So we've got the two extremes, hyperinflation on one end and a deflationary death spiral on the other end. So the question is, which one will we get, or which one will we get closest to? So let's talk about why, while one of those two outcomes is inevitable, neither one will change the amount of economic pain felt as a result. And this is because a colossal deleveraging is happening either way. But before we can deleverage, first you have to leverage up. So what is leverage? Well, physically speaking, we all know what leverage is, right? It's the ability of an object to exert more force on another object by use of something like a lever, which is an object that hinges on a fulcrum. So you might not be able to lift a car, but given a lever that is large enough, you could. Financially speaking, it's the same thing. Leverage allows you to spend more purchasing power, to use more purchasing power than you would be able to otherwise. And in other words, leverage is debt. And you know how this works. Let's say you bring $5,000 home in income and you spend $6,000. You've got no savings, so how were you able to spend more than you actually made in terms of income? There's only one way. That is debt. You borrowed that money from somebody else. That is leverage. You were able to spend $6,000 even though you only made $5,000. For another example, let's say you make $100,000 in a year and you spend the full $100,000 on bills, but you also bought a car for $50,000. Well, this year you actually spent $150,000 even though you only made $100,000. What's the only way you were able to do this? A car loan. So leverage, or debt, gives you more purchasing power than you have with just your earnings. But the only way to make that possible is if you pay for that debt, you pay off that debt, you reduce that leverage at some point in the future with future earnings. So if you spend $6,000 this month, you're making $5,000, you spend $6,000 this month, that means next month you can only spend $4,000 because you have to pay off that $1,000 credit card balance. And with the car example, you spent $150,000 this year, but that means for the next 5 years, you can only spend $90,000 because you need to take $10,000 of that every year for 5 years to pay off that $50,000 car loan. So debt or leverage doesn't magically make money appear. All it's doing is pulling purchasing power forward from the future into the present. And when you get to that future, that purchasing power is reduced by the amount that was already spent. And the reason for this is because when you borrow, when you use leverage or debt, you are spending somebody else's savings. Now, if you borrow from grandma, this is very clear, right? She's got an extra $1,000. You say, Grandma, I need some help. She gives you $1,000. Later, you give it back, right? Very clear. With a credit card, it's not so clear because financial institutions, banks, they have the ability to do something that seems like magic. They loan money into existence. When you swipe your credit card at the store, that money is not directly coming from grandma's savings account. That money that you spent did not exist before you swiped that card. Those dollars used for that transaction were loaned into existence. As you swipe, once you swipe, there are now more dollars today than there were right before that swipe. So you spent money into existence. But here's the catch. That new money that you spent into existence only has purchasing power as a percent of all the existing purchasing power from all the existing money. And if you can't quite wrap your head around that, here's an example as to why that's the case. Let's say that your credit card available balance was equal to all of the money in existence. So that meant if you wanted to go max out your credit card, you would actually be doubling the total supply of money. If you went and did this, that would mean that prices on average would double. Now, obviously it would depend on where you spend that money, what you spend that money on, right? Because if you spend it all on houses, that'll bid up the prices of houses because you're soaking up all of the supply. You're coming in as a buyer and just buying up all of the supply, driving up prices. It would happen the same thing if you did it on cars, but on average, if you double the supply of money, you're gonna have an average increase of prices of around double. Just look at what happened when the Hunt brothers tried to corner the market in silver. They used their fortune to try and buy up all the silver. What did that do to the silver price? It drove it up because they soaked up a lot of the supply. So all else being equal, when new money is created out of nothing and then works its way throughout the economy, it pushes prices up. And this is how bank credit expansion causes inflation. Now, back to the credit card example. Remember, you spent that money into existence, but that's not the end of the story. You have to pay off that credit card balance next month. This is the opposite of inflation. This is actually deflation. You are destroying money by paying off your credit card balance. You spend less this month than you did last month and you have nothing left over. You pay back that loan and now those dollars are not in circulation anymore. This is deleveraging. This is deflation. There's less money in circulation now than there was before, which means that there is less money representing the amount of goods and services, so prices go down to the extent of the money that was destroyed. So after 2 months, the first month you spend $6,000, the second month you spend $4,000, you've done the same total spending that you would have without that leverage in the first place, an average of $5,000 each month. So on net, you don't have an increase or decrease in the total money supply because you've just spent your earnings. All you did was rearrange the months in which that spending happened. But what happens if you don't pay off that credit card bill? What happens if you declare bankruptcy? Does that inflation become permanent then because you don't ever pay it off? No, because a default carries the same level of deflation that just regular deleveraging paying off that debt would. The only difference is the lender loses instead of the borrower. The borrower got kind of a free lunch because he got to spend money he didn't have and then didn't have to give it back. It's the lender that loses in this case because the lender had an asset which was a promise from you that you would repay what you took, and now that promise doesn't exist anymore. That asset disappears, becomes worthless. They aren't getting that money back, it's gone forever. So it is clear that a default on debt, not being able to pay back what was borrowed, carries the same amount of deflation as paying that loan back does. Now, as a side note, this is why the national debt will never be repaid, because by definition, that would be deflation. It would contract the total money supply by at least the amount that was being paid back. As all of that money got sucked up to pay that back, money would become extremely scarce. That money would cease to be in circulation, would cease to be in existence, and the value of each remaining dollar would be worth a lot more relative to the amount of goods and services left in the system, meaning that everything would become extremely cheap relative to the money. And if all of the debt in existence was paid off, that would mean the total money left over in the system would be exactly zero. But that's a story for another time. Paying off debt is a deflationary form of deleveraging because the total amount of debt in the system goes down as that debt is destroyed, as that debt is paid off, and the total amount of money in the system goes down. So it's a deflationary deleveraging. Defaulting on that debt is also deleveraging because that debt no longer exists, so the amount of debt in the system comes down, so it's deleveraging, but it's also deflationary because the total money supply comes down when that default happens. So both paying off debt through austerity and defaulting on debt by just not paying it back, both of these are forms of deflationary deleveraging. And if this happens on a broad economic scale where it's happening everywhere, and because it happens over here, it makes somebody happen over here, and it makes it happen over here where you don't pay me, and so now I can't pay you, and you have kind of a domino effect of this deflationary deleveraging go throughout the system. You have people who can't afford to buy many things. You have many shortages appear. You have broad economic pain. So then the question is, what if we just print the debt away? Does this solve the problem? Is inflationary deleveraging a free lunch? So to illustrate this, let's have Congress pass a bill, and let's call it the Jubilee Act. This bill is passed, and in this bill, first thing they do is they fully absorb the Federal Reserve. Now they have complete control over the money printer. The next thing they do is they completely retire all of the debt that's held on the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, because at that point it's just the money that the government owes to itself, and so they retire it. And then all of the other debt, the rest of the $20 trillion that the government owes to individuals, corporations, foreign countries, what they do is they just start printing money in order to pay the interest. And when that debt comes due, when it matures, they don't roll it over by taking out new debt to pay off that old debt. They're not creating new debt. They just use the money printer to pay that off. So it'll take a little bit of time, but they're paying off all of their debt with the money printer. The next thing they do is they purchase all outstanding debt from all lenders. They purchase all the mortgages. They purchase all the car loans. They purchase all the credit card loans, all the personal loans, all the business loans. All the debt that exists in the country, they print money and buy it from the lender. So now those lenders don't have anybody owing anything to them anymore. And now everybody who has a loan, now they owe that money to the government. And now you get to the final part of the plan. Now that the government owns all of the debt, they strike it out. They wipe it clean and they declare it paid in full. So it seems like everybody wins here, right? You've got the lenders, like the banks, they've got no more outstanding loans, but they didn't have to take a hit on them. They got paid for them. They just sold them. So they've got all the cash that they were expecting to get. You've got the borrowers made whole, because especially all the individuals and corporations who had a mountain of debt that they were never going to be able to pay off, now they don't owe any of that debt anymore. So suddenly, literally every player in the system is flush with cash and has zero liabilities. Well, first of all, it's important to recognize this is a deleveraging, because the total amount of leverage in the system went from all-time highs to zero. So what's the problem? Well, as I said earlier, and it still stands, leverage pulls purchasing power forward from the present into the future. And so when you get to the future and that deleveraging happens, the purchasing power that's in existence at that point is necessarily less to an equal extent of whatever was pulled from the future into your now past. But does that happen here when you just print away all the debt? Yes, 100%. Take the example of the pizza. You've got 8 slices. Do you get more pizza by just taking a knife and cutting it into 16 slices? No, still the same amount of pizza, just more slices. What about 32 slices? What about 64 slices? Do you get any more pizza the more you cut it up? No, the same amount of pizza. In the same respect, an economy is measured in money, but the real wealth is with goods and services. So if you 10x or 100x the amount of money in the system, it doesn't change the amount of goods and services. It just changes the denomination, the units that are used to measure those same goods and services. It doesn't change the amount of purchasing power. It just changes what you call that purchasing power. Maybe instead of calling it $1, now you have to call it $100. Now you have to call it $1,000. You're still purchasing the same amount of stuff you otherwise would have been able to without the change in the number of units of currency. So in an inflationary debt jubilee, where you wipe out all the debt by printing money and handing that money out, the total amount of money in the system is going to 10x or 100x, or depending on the leverage and how widespread it is, 1,000x maybe. It's the same amount of stuff though. So over a very short amount of time, you'll experience a wealth effect, because that money will start to work its way throughout the economy. People will think that they're much richer than they really are, because prices will be skyrocketing. You'll have so much more money entering the system ready to buy the same amount of stuff. But very quickly, people will realize they don't have enough money to buy a lot of the stuff that they need or want. You'll realize that shortages start to come up. You'll see broad economic pain. Sound familiar? Same thing that would happen in a deflationary deleveraging. So deleveraging is the process by which purchasing power contracts. It corrects to compensate for the amount of purchasing power that was removed from the future and taken into the past. That purchasing power was already used. There's no way around it. Whether you have inflation or deflation, that purchasing power was already used because of the leverage. So we can look back at history and see that pretty much every time a country gets to the same level or even less level of leverage as we have right now, usually policymakers take the route out of the leverage through the inflationary camp. They try and print it away. And there are different winners and different losers depending on whether you get the deflationary deleveraging or the inflationary deleveraging, but either way, the deleveraging still takes place as the economy must pay the price of the decadence of years past. As always, I really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.